Please submit to recording or I will summarily eject you. Okay, welcome everybody to this 2024 legislative update put on by your central section of the California chapter of the American Planning Association. I am your host, Jeff O'Neill. Joining me also is Jared Olson. I guess let's dive right in. I'm Jeff O'Neill. As mentioned, I work for Provo and Pritchard Consulting here in Clovis, and I'm the legislative representative to the chapter from our beloved section. And do you want to introduce yourself, Jared?
Sure. I'm Jared Olson, senior planner also with Provost and Pritchard, and I am the director of administration and finance with the Central California section of the APA.
Very good. All right, let's dive right in. So we're going to go over some important legislation that popped up during the 23-24 California legislative session. I know we're a few months out of date here since most of these things took effect January 1st, although we will also talk about a couple of things that took place or that took effect last year. And hopefully we've all been implementing those. And the intent, with a couple of exceptions, is that rather than do deep dives into individual pieces of legislation, we'll kind of go over the high points or low points of some of them, and then open it up for questions. And then our contact information will be made available at the end of the webinar. So if you have further questions about anything that we go over, we're more than welcome to have you reach out and we can address them on a one-to-one basis. So let's go for it. Okay. So 23-24, more than 2,100 bills were introduced by the legislature, of which 400 plus directly related to planning and had the huge potential to deeply affect all of us. As was pointed out at the 2024 APA California conference in Riverside last September, more than 1,200 bills ultimately made it to the governor's office, and way too many of them were signed. Something that may have been snuck in, and probably we're all aware of this by now, the Office of Planning and Research, which has been around since 1970 under that name, was now changed to the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. So we no longer have OPR, we have LCI. Starting right off, under the category of equity, inclusion, and social justice, SB 1187 created a tribal housing grant program under HCD, and a companion bill also created a funding committee within HCD to tell HCD how to fund the housing grant program. More stringent, and let a couple more people in here. Thanks to the handful of you that just joined. We just started. We're on essentially the first slide that discusses anything of importance. There were some changes made to how we deal with wetlands, aside from how we may deal with them under federal law. Not only is the state policy now to ensure that we don't have a net loss of wetlands, but we're also required to create more wetlands in certain circumstances. AB 687, which is Prop 4, authorizes $10 billion in bonds for drinking water, drought, flood water, wildfire, importantly, forest coastal resilience, heat mitigation, biodiversity, and nature-based climate solutions, farming-related dollars, ranches, working lands, creating parks and outdoor access, clean air. So interestingly, there were several wildfire bills that didn't move forward, along with bills related to emergency preparedness and regulations for incidental take permits related to wildfire preparedness. As we all are well aware by now, huge tragedy in Southern California related to wildfires over the last few months. Can't say for sure that these bills would have had a tremendous effect on that, but in hindsight, kind of unfortunate. There was a select committee formed on permitting reform that was intended to examine permitting processes that focused on housing, energy, water, and climate resilience at the state level. In the category of infrastructure services and fees, local agencies are now required to permit charging stations in public rights of way. A number of cities were already doing that anyway, but now it is a requirement to allow a certain number of on-street parking spaces to be used as electric vehicle charging stations. There were already some exemptions under the Subdivision Map Act related to certain mining activities, solar PV facilities. Now there's an exemption for property leases related to electric and hydrogen charging stations. So those are no longer subject to the MAP Act. And then SB 1140 expanded enhanced infrastructure and financing districts. We had some changes to how we look at infrastructure and fees. We're now required to provide fee information upon request, even before projects are finalized. Cities have been doing this kind of haphazardly over the years. A lot of times, while the general fee information, whether it's part of a master fee schedule for processing fees or a schedule for mitigation fee act related fees, the agencies are now required to provide more concrete estimates of what fee estimates will be prior to issuing conditions of approval, prior to project approval, and so forth. And even before you have an actual final version of the project. So that could be kind of a dynamic discussion depending on whether there are project changes. Projects near major transit stops are now subject to lowered traffic impact fees. And also the definition of major transit stop was expanded to include 20-minute service rather than 15-minute service. I don't know how many of our facilities in the central section that will affect, although there is the possibility that it will, for example, using the city of Fresno, if we have 15-minute bus rapid transit or 10-minute bus rapid transit, but then we have regular 20-minute stops, those would now be considered major transit stops. So that has the potential to expand or I guess reduce the applicability of certain traffic impact fees, as well as provide other exemptions under CEQA for proximity to major transit stops. AB 2663 changed reporting requirements for inclusionary housing in lieu fees. And by 2032, agencies' websites will be required to include an impact fee calculator accessible to the public. So it'll enhance public access, development access to the development fee calculator so they can get an estimate of what their fees would be based on the project they proposed. That only applies to residential and mixed-use projects, and it requires HCD to develop a template that we can implement on our local agency websites. So under AB 3177, local agencies are now precluded from requiring dedication and improvement of streets to mitigate traffic impacts, improve LOS, or achieve a desired roadway width, unless it meets certain criteria. And generally we end up with a lot of things under our recent planning and zoning law changes that say, well, you can't do this unless you make specific health and safety findings. So we'll see if there's any kind of an update to this as cities start coming up with very creative health and safety determinations about their ability to require street improvements. SB 937 further restricted local agencies' ability to levy early fees on until issuance of a certificate of occupancy. Although you're still allowed to collect fees related to specific installation of services when those services are requested, the criteria that the cities have to meet have become more stringent, and it has to be based on the actual cost of improvement and or if the city has already outlaid funds to install certain pieces of infrastructure. And then SB 1210 requires utilities providers of all kinds to provide estimated costs and timeframes for when their infrastructure will be available to development. AB 2085 requires ministerial approval of community clinics, which are essentially defined as clinics that are run by a nonprofit and that provide services on an ability to pay basis. Those must now be approved ministerially on land zoned for office, retail, parking, or healthcare facilities. And in a similar vein, local agencies are now prohibited from treating thrift stores differently from other similar retail stores by either imposing different fees, different development standards, those sorts of things. AB 2533 increased the amnesty for unpermitted ADUs. So if there are unpermitted ADUs on a piece of property and the property owner wishes to kind of legitimize that use, again, unless there are very specific health and safety related issues that the city determines, then the city is required to essentially provide a retroactive permit for those ADUs that may have been unlawfully constructed. SB 747 cleaned up the ADU statutes and added some provisions about how housing elements work. Fortunately, we're all either done or getting close to being done with our 6th cycle, so we won't have to worry about some of that for another handful of years. Interestingly, the ADU statute cleanup appeared in March of last year, so it was kind of a mid-year change to the statutes, and it removed all ADU discussion from where it had always existed under planning and zoning law, and rather than just revise that, it just created a whole new set of sections at the 66-310. And if you get your brand new copy of the 2025 ACEC statute books, it shows those as having been added this year, because by the time we got our books last year, the law had already changed, and it wasn't they had been printed before any of that happened. So in fact, those statutes are, in fairness to the legislature, they are cleaned up. They're easier to understand. They're still convoluted. But that was a good change in my opinion. SB 1211 increases the number of allowable ADUs with multifamily dwellings to 8. You may recall prior to that it was 2. Local agencies are now prohibited under AB 2430 from charging any kind of fee to monitor affordability under density bonus law. Previously, if a project was subject to some kind of affordability covenant and that was required to be monitored annually, local agencies could charge for staff time needed to go through and ensure that the affordability criteria were still being met. And now that is outlawed. Residential care facilities for the elderly now qualify as senior housing under density bonus law. And then there were also some changes made regarding how student housing is counted as affordable under density bonus law. We have officially now 2 new income categories for affordability, which are extremely low and acutely low, with extremely being less than 30% of area median income, and acutely low being under 15% or less of the area median income. As mentioned, there were a lot of other changes to housing element law that we will have to deal with during the 7th cycle. And we'll be doing some updates on those kind of things in future webinars. We are now required to ministerially approve subdivisions of vacant single-family land for up to 10 units, either subject to a parcel map or a tentative and final map, depending on the number of lots that are created. Previously, that applied to multifamily. Now it applies to vacant single family as well. A big one that we're starting to run into is AB 2904, which requires that local agencies provide at least a 20-day public hearing notice for zoning changes that affect the use of real property. And that had always been 10 days. And interestingly, the statute expressly says this applies to planning commission. However, there is some wrinkled folks who have gotten the ear of some attorneys and are taking the position that, well, the legislature didn't account for the fact that some cities don't have planning commissions. And so this law effectively does nothing to enhance any public noticing standards. And those attorneys are suggesting that we implement this at the city council level as well, despite the fact that that's not what the statute says to do. So more on that to come. Under CEQA, we have a new infill exemption. That is, it's a statutory exemption rather than the similar to the existing categorical infill exemption. But it provides for infill exemptions for unincorporated land within urbanized areas. The requirements are very, very similar to the 332 exemption that we're also used to, except that it expressly states that it has to be an unincorporated area, but it has to be in an urbanized area or urban cluster in order to work. So it doesn't really help any of the projects that come across our plates that are in more rural vicinity. And then SB 768 requires HCD to study how VMT actually is used to measure transportation impacts of housing projects. There was a little Hoover Commission on CEQA reform, and the recommendations that came out of that were that there should be enhanced requirements needed in order to file CEQA lawsuits, to limit submittal of input after close of comment period, since as we come across, we both have a review and comment period, but then people are allowed to submit comments up to the end of the hearing at which the CEQA document is considered. So the suggestion there is to just say that once you have the comment period has closed, you can no longer make comments specifically related to CEQA. A big one, which would be to exempt all housing from CEQA review, to fund better judicial training regarding CEQA, to reaffirm that courts should defer to the statute and the guideline and interpret rather than create legislation, and then to develop clear parameters for significance thresholds and mitigation. AB 1889 requires that conservation elements consider wildlife movement corridors and habitat connectivity, while 2684 requires safety elements to consider extreme heat. That was scaled back. That was originally supposed to, I'm sorry, the 1889 was scaled back. That was actually supposed to originally involve a wildlife connectivity element to the general plan, which fortunately cooler heads prevailed, and that just got scaled back to being part of the conservation element. Safety element, again, to consider the effects of extreme heat. And then most importantly is Assembly Bill 98, at which point I will hand this over to Jared Olson, and he will pick up where I have left off.
Thank you, Jeff. So AB 98 was definitely a pretty controversial bill. It kind of showed up at the last minute, and it had very big consequences. For most jurisdictions, I would say more so for the Western Riverside COG area, since they have been hit with much sooner deadlines to get these things across. But yeah, AB 98 is named after my favorite English reggae pop band. Can you advance this slide? I don't think I can control it from here. So AB AB 98 affects warehouses, logistical facility development, and where it requires the demolition of housing, replacement housing, in addition to citing these facilities near established truck routes, and also mandates that truck routes be identified in your circulation element. Next slide. All right, and let's focus on what a logistics use is. So it's a pretty good definition. However, it is very broad too. A building in which cargo, goods, or products are moved or stored for later distribution to businesses and or retail customers. So definitely your Amazons, your logistical facilities, but one could also see this as these uses are found in more than just those buildings. Goods and products are moved all of the time. That's how goods movement works. But it does specifically exempt retail customers for on-site purchases, and it does require that heavy-duty trucks are primarily involved in those goods movements. It does exempt places like grocery stores or like your Amazon food facilities, and also buildings primarily served by rail. And it also has a carve out for strategic intermodal facilities possessing those features identified there on the screen. Next slide. So do what the proclaimers do and set back those buildings 900 feet. Loading bays within 900 feet of a sensitive receptor does trigger AB 98's development standards, of which I believe the next screen will go into more detail on. Yeah. So so it really breaks it down into three separate categories: less than 250,000 square feet, more than 250,000 square feet, and those that are not currently zoned industrial or need a rezone to allow that. So some zoning ordinances allow industrial uses not in industrial zones, subject to a conditional use permit. So those types of projects would fall under that middle column there. But those development centers do specify that truck loading bays need to be on the opposite side of the building from sensitive receptors. Loading bays need to be set back between 300 and 500 feet. That is confusing because it is not 900 feet, but what the 900 feet simply does is says if you have a facility within 900 feet, you're subject to all of these additional standards. So hence setback 900 feet and you're good from there. It also requires separate entrances for heavy duty trucks. So that is generally to allow for those truck trips to be further away from sensitive receptors. Oh, okay. Move on to the next slide. I think we lost the presentation there, Jeff.
Can you make me the host again?
Oh,
I mean, you can, will you?
Oh, yes. There you go.
There we go.
Excellent. Thank you. The next slide. And then truck entry, exit, internal circulation also needs to be positioned away from sensitive receptors. One of the largest, well, the two largest impacts are definitely the landscaped buffer requirements, which vary between 50 to 100 feet. That seems a little bit overkill. And ideally, for those projects that are subject to CEQA, I would much rather have seen that be based on what is proposed, not something that is, absolutely certain. And then also the 21st century warehouse requirements, which I'll go into detail on the next slide, I believe, but it breaks it down into tier 1 and non-tier 1 based on the square footage size. So really anything 250,000 square feet or above needs to meet the tier 1 requirement. Everything less than that doesn't need to meet those standards. So next slide. So this is where the real difference is. It needs to meet or exceed the California Energy and Green Code. Not that big of a deal. That already generally needs to be done anyway. However, for tier 1 facilities, you also need to provide 50% to your parking stalls need to be installed with electric vehicle conduit, as well as 10% of those stalls need to be actually EV ready, where the actual chargers have been installed. Skylights on 1% of the roof area or the equivalent lighting, electric hookups for all cold storage loading bays, zero emission forklifts and small off-road engines when feasible. Cost is not considered as part of that feasibility, so it's more of, are they actually manufactured or not? That's right. And then the one thing that I'm not sure that anyone's really ready for, we're still trying to find out what this all means, is a microgrid ready switchgear and advanced smart meter ready. I think that what they're looking for is facilities that can run completely off of solar and battery storage and wouldn't necessarily have to rely on the electrical grid, which can be nice for some projects as they are waiting to obtain transformers or the permitting process through PG. So certainly something that we are looking at more and just trying to figure out how much these things cost, and but ultimately it would be on the developer to implement. Next slide. Other development standards also include truck stacking, which is a minimum of 50 feet, and it increases for every 20 bays exceeding 50 bays. So just something to consider for site planning purposes. Anti-idling requirements drops from, I believe, state law is 5 minutes. Now, for these types of projects, it would be 3 minutes. And then a truck routing plan and on-site signage to basically direct drivers to the nearest truck route. Next slide. There's also locational and approval requirements. So this is something that cities and counties need to be aware of. These facilities need to be sited on roadways that are either an arterial, collector, major thoroughfare or a local road that predominantly serves commercial uses. There are exceptions that are provided, but they must incorporate mitigation to minimize traffic and environmental impacts to the greatest extent feasible. And this lives beyond CEQA. So traffic can mean congestion, really. So just something to consider there. It also cannot approve development of a logistics use that does not meet or exceed those standards that were previously discussed. So that could be at time of site plan review. It could even mean at time of building permits too. So there are some exceptions for vested projects, and those are listed in AB 98. You can look at there. For projects that received their approval prior to adoption of AB 98 are exempt. So I would imagine that those facilities would be developed first. Next slide. Replacement housing. There is a 2-to-1 replacement for any demolished dwelling that was occupied in the last 10 years, unless it was declared substandard by a building official prior to purchase by the developer. That needs to be, replacement housing must be deed restricted to and affordable to low or moderate income households and built within the jurisdiction that the facility was permitted. And then if fees are collected, like say for an in lieu fee, those funds must be put in a set aside account and used for housing within 3 years. It says used for housing, it doesn't specify exactly. So I am not an attorney, however, so definitely consult with your attorney on how to interpret that. If dwelling units are going to be affected through a purchase, displaced tenants must be provided with 12 months rent. I'm assuming that if you are, Mark, that's also in Assembly Bill 98. If a developer is purchasing the property directly from the owner, I'm assuming that 12 months rent would be at least equivalent to 12 months rent, or the purchase price. Next slide. So despite all of this, AB 98 does not apply to projects where there are no sensitive receptors within 900 feet of a loading bay or is part of a mixed-use development that creates sensitive receptors. So if you have a project that is both residential and industrial, that's not that project will not be subject to AB 98. So certainly something to consider and to advise potential applicants on if you so wish. Next slide. Replacement housing, developers can certainly require an inspection by the building official prior to purchase, or like I said, they can build mixed use if the zoning allows. Jurisdictions, it would certainly help to ask or cities to ask counties to prohibit a residential or zone industrial areas planned for industrial uses. Hard mode. it would probably be good to establish a residential displacement impacts fee and then spread that burden across all industrial lands. So then that way, developers wouldn't be hit with the full burden of paying those fees. That would be a much more streamlined approach and can be addressed at a later point. Next slide. AB 98 also, like I said, affects truck routes and circulation elements. In the circulation element, it does require jurisdictions to identify and establish specific truck routes to safely accommodate additional truck traffic, avoid residential areas, sensitive receptors. It also requires the maximizing the use of interstate and state highways, arterials, major thoroughfares, and all of the other street classifications previously discussed. It also requires discussing the posting of truck routes, truck parking, and appropriate idling facility signs. These are required to be in the circulation element, which seems to be getting into the nitty gritty, but hey, that's what it says. It also requires that jurisdictions make available their truck routes in GIS, sharing of GIS maps of those truck routes with warehouse operators, fleet operators, and truck drivers. A good practice, I would say. And then this is generally part of the process anyway of amending many element of your general plan, but opportunity for involvement from the general public, agencies, tribes, and others must be provided. And these updates must be provided to everywhere outside of the Western Riverside COG area by January 1st, 2028, to avoid a biannual $50,000 fine from the Attorney General. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will fine you, but that the Attorney General does have the discretion to go after jurisdictions that haven't done these things yet. Next slide. Now, these circulation element requirements will also trigger some other things that have already been adopted in the government code. These also include the incorporation of Vision Zero principles, development of bicycle plans, pedestrian plans, traffic calming plans. And so these are things that need to be proposed in your circulation element, and implementation of those additional items must be identified within 2 years. So jurisdictions would need to also come up with a 2-year implementation plan for how these things are going to be. And that's it for me. I'll hand it back over to you, Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Jared. Okay, so as you can see, Jared specifically did a pretty in-depth assessment of AB 98. There already before the end of December, the certain members of the legislature hearing various lobbyists, including the chapter APA, have already introduced bills to clean up and otherwise amend AB 98 because of some of its vague descriptions of definitions, requirements. So we'll disseminate more information as those move through the legislature. Also, thanks for that. Also, the chapter legislative committee of which I am a member as the section representative. We'll be meeting this month to go over the complete list of planning related bills that are being introduced in 24-25, and we'll start providing more information on those. As mentioned at the beginning, there are any number of bills that get introduced and then kind of either get melded in with others, consolidated, or that just go away, or they get substantially changed to the point where they're unrecognizable. But we will start providing some information about those, the hot topic bills that the chapter is watching, so that the section members and our section practicing planners can be aware of what may be coming down the pipeline, and help you prepare for implementation, especially when you have to present that information to your elected officials, your appointed officials, members of the public, to hopefully make your job a little bit easier. Before we take question, I want to thank Cindy Lemare, who's not on the call. She's our director for professional development. She got this put up on the APA website, and there is certification maintenance credit available for it. And to Jenna Chilingarian, who does all of the work behind the scenes to make these things happen, as our director of membership and public information. And then, of course, Johnny Lan is on the call, and she's our section board president. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to Jared. We do have a little bit of time if anybody, I know there were a couple of questions in the chat. One specifically related to, well, two actually related to availability of the slides. Yes, we will put out the slideshow, and for what it's worth, the recording as well. And Jenna will, of course, be in charge of that. And on the housing replacement, that was all still part of, once we started on AB 98, it was all AB 98 from there on out. Jerry, did you want to tackle that first? Yes, I mean, I guess I can. Yeah, all of the circulation element stuff was AB 98 related.
Yeah, the triggers for the Vision Zero principles and the bicycle plans, those have already existed in the government code. I believe that they were placed there a couple years ago, and those provisions are only triggered upon a substantial revision of your circulation element. So I would anticipate that that making any revisions to your circulation element to comply with AB 98 would then also could also then trigger the Vision Zero principles changes. And I can point out the government code section for you in just a couple minutes. Yeah.
And I would like to add on to that a little bit. I can't say that this is the specific history of AB 98, but related to logistics centers and similar types of development, that's a large environmental justice concern over the last, I don't know, decade or more, where these types of uses are historically placed in more industrial areas that may have older housing, older communities of interest that that may be unduly impacted by air quality and noise issues related to idling vehicles, traffic congestion, heavy traffic, and those sorts of things. So another contributing factor to AB 98, and on a smaller scale, scrutiny given to projects for the types of uses that are the subject of AB 98.
And I'm going to put in the chat right now the government code section for where those changes that prompt the additional things live. So I'll get that over to you right now. Let's see if I can find a better link to that too. Yeah. Any other questions on any of the bills discussed?
Seeing none, thanks for joining us. Sorry for the roughness of some of the presentation. Not used to doing larger Zoom-based webinars, so hopefully some information was conveyed, and you have our contact information. If you have any other questions, the CenCal website's up there along with our email addresses. And if there are any one-on-one questions after the fact, we'd be more than happy to assist. And I will get this information to Jenna and she can get it up on the website. So thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks everyone.